what you're going to talk about in your keynote, and then we'll sort of go off from there and talk about the goodies that you brought.
Sure. So I'll be talking about the fourth industrial revolution.
Wow, okay.
and healthcare and what I think might be coming. And I'll be contextualizing that by talking about the first three industrial revolutions,
Right.
what they were, who were the champions of that, and what their impact was, and then set the scene by then talking about the fourth, and then lay out a bit of a challenge to the audience, because the bulk of the audience in the room is graduate students, and
Sure.
And put out the idea that it's not known who the champions of that will be, and it's very likely to be people like them, so people that have a tech background going into medicine, because it's personalized health tilt, and give a few insights into my journey in this particular space.
Right.
So that's a kind of a summary. And the champions, just so you know, the first industrial revolution was steam, primarily mechanical,
Right.
and it was slow, but still a revolution.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of impact with those revolutions, but one champion that I'll talk about is a guy called Brunel, who was an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And the second, coming closer to where you're from, which is the US, is Edison. So
Okay.
electrical, and actually Henry Ford was another champion as well. So it got quicker, that electrical revolution. I'll talk about him as a champion. And then the third is a guy that's been around in our lifetime. So the third revolution was computers, the internet, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've selected Steve Jobs as an example of that. In fact, the iPhone as an embodiment of the third industrial revolution. Each one was faster, and each one's had greater impact more quickly. And then the fourth, of course, be setting the scene of what's taking off, why we think it's going to be different, and then the different technologies, and also the type of thinking that we're going to need in order to be able to handle all of this stuff taking place at once.
Well, when it raises an interesting question, so why is it useful for us to frame these as individual revolutions, or what was it about each of these sort of big leaps that we made that led to major disruptions and ultimately the world that we know today?
That's right. I mean, it's a fair question because there's overlap in how these things happen, but it's a good way of thinking of it is a series of curves. There's a baseline curve that happened with the first, and then there's a big change that happened with electricity and manufacturing for the second, and then the third, we can very clearly and distinctly visualize the advent of computers coming in our lifetime. I'm showing my age a little bit here, but
in my lifetime.
Yeah. But and the internet and the huge impact of that. So that they're clear inflection points.
Yeah.
The fourth one's harder to describe in some ways because there's a whole bunch of inflection points taking off at the same time. Yeah. So you've got these things happening. Of course, let's start with talking about the Internet of Things. That's clear, and there's thinking that there's going to be like a trillion devices connected to the internet within the next few years.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, but kind of expected because it's continuing that path. But it's all of these other things that are taking off at the same time. So we have genomics taking off. We have phenomics. We have robotics. We have all manner of other things happening. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like suddenly for the first time there's so many different new tools in the tool shed that we've never had to deploy. And how we configure those in the space of healthcare is going to be really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I deliberately talk about the first three champions of the Industrial Revolutions as engineers in the engineering space. Yeah. And Steve Jobs is embodiment of that. Sadly, there's no obvious examples of champions that are women in that space. Mm-hmm. And so kind of one of the challenges will be, it's because our audience here at KAUST is engineers and scientists. Yeah. And so what's it going to take for engineers and scientists to really make a difference in healthcare? What kind of thinking do you need to have? And how do we hold up a photograph that perhaps one of the people in the room might be one of those, and maybe even one of the women in the room as well? So, yeah, I'm interested to make it as interactive as possible with the audience.
Excellent. And that's going to end up being streamed live on Facebook, I believe, as well. So people outside of the walls of KAUST can experience it, which is a great thing.
That's right. No pressure. Yeah.
What are the inventions or innovations that have really led to this fourth industrial revolution? And perhaps, do you think we're just starting it? Are we in the middle? Has it largely happened already? Where are we on that wave, essentially?
That's a good question. I think this decade will be quite pivotal in a time point of when this has started. And you can see a trickle of inventions in this space. So one case in point, we're both wearing, I can look across and see on your wrist an Apple Watch. Mm-hmm. And it's a starting point on that journey as a wearable device. And I'm not going to criticize the Apple Watch. I think it's a fantastic device that just years ago couldn't have been possible.
Right.
But in the context of healthcare, it's still in some ways very lightweight. It's a toy, and I get the feeling we'll look at the Apple Watch even in a decade from now, perhaps the same way that we look at comparing Netflix with a 1950s television, right? All of the changes that take place. So it's still doing images, but it's done in such a different way.
Yeah.
And so that march up the value chain for wearable devices into genuine medical devices, I can see that playing out. And it's going to be really interesting. And of course, you've got to ask the question why. So why might that be useful?
Right.
And so the biggest, let's play a game. Mm-hmm. So it's a morbid game, but it's a game. So what do you think the biggest killer on the planet is for people? So what's the biggest source of that?
I want to say some form of heart disease, but I do think that suicide is up there as well. So people's choice to end their life, and I think probably some things related to diabetes and obesity is probably up in the game as well.
That's a pretty good analysis. So the biggest death source of death is cardiovascular disease. So as you started with that, so it's about 20 million deaths, and it's interesting because it's actually greater than cancer. A lot of people think it's cancer. It's not. Or infectious disease. Infectious disease is about 14 million deaths, and then we look at you start to think of the reasons why those deaths are taking place, and of course, as always in healthcare, it's complicated. But let's look at a subset of that, which is heart attacks. So there's about 7 million heart attacks per year, and quite a lot of those kill people. Yeah. So in this day and age, you can still have someone who thinks that they're fine and have a heart attack and die. And those sorts of events, like strokes, are time critical events. They're events that if you're able to get an intervention quickly, you can arrest it or even potentially prevent that from taking place.
Right.
And they're the kind of scenarios that a continuous monitoring wearable device could really have a huge impact. So as one example, the kind of device I'm wearing here is an embodiment of something that we're working on. So it's called a micro wearable. And the idea is that it's continuously monitoring your troponin, which is a protein. It's a biomarker that's released as your heart gets damaged.
Oh, okay.
And so it's measuring the curve, and it picks up when that curve starts taking off.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that it lets you know you're having a heart attack even before you can tell it's taking place, right?
I see.
And that will allow it buys you the time for the prevention and dealing with that situation before it becomes critical.
Yeah, like how long are we talking? Minutes, hours, days? Like, what's the time scale for that?
That's a great question, and interestingly, it's not really known because people haven't been able to get those baseline curves. They just know that each heart attack is different. Some can be very rapid, and others can sort of percolate along and then grow. So we don't know how much time we're going to buy. That's one of the things we need to find out.
Is being a wearable device wearer, is that contributing to the science around types of things like this? So is the idea that you would get this type of device onto a mass market device, and then it would feed data from millions and millions of people so that you'd learn those things?
So it's a great word, learn, right? So we still have so much to learn in this space, and how we deal with the data piece, that's something we need to think through. But what we do know is that there's it's one thing to have the thought experiments, another to actually put this to work in a useful way. So one example is there's an important cohort of people that have already had heart attacks, and they're the people that already have a damaged heart and are at high risk for a follow-up heart attack.
I see.
And that particular case would be, there's a high chance it would be lethal.
Yeah.
So I can imagine a good starting point would be beginning with those individuals wearing those. But another way we can look at this is starting in a different area. So I'm looking at this this bottle of water.
Yeah.
Imagine another embodiment of this, which is just a continuous monitoring of hydration.
I see, yeah.
So that's actually what this is. It's a sports hydration device. And it turns out to be a far bigger problem than people realize or think.
Yeah.
And just by getting this out into the sports people and the consumer space, it can make a big difference even before it progresses as a medical device.
Right.
So they're things that we're thinking through.
Right. I'm a fan of cycling, and that would be a tremendous thing for the team car to know as they're monitoring the health of riders, to know whether they're, because a constant conversation over the course of a Grand Tour is someone eating and drinking enough? Are they hydrated? Is that affecting their performance? So that would be very interesting to know, quite apart from the fact that it would be good to save people's lives. With
That's right.
This type of
that's right. And there's many other potential applications. Of course, we're talking off air about the bushfires in Australia. So helping with the firefighters in that situation, other industrial situations like that. But I've underestimated the utility in the space of hydration.
Right. So you brought several other inventions with you, and I want to get to those, but I'm always curious to know, for someone who's a serial inventor, someone who's a serial innovator, what drives you to do that? What led you to be an inventor, and why do you continue to do so?
So I've always been very curious about how things work and why they don't. And I tend to not just accept the answer for why it's not working. I tend to explore that and push that boundary. I've always been that way. So where did it all start? So it started with my training. My formal training was in mechanical engineering, and my PhD was in a field called hypervelocity aerodynamics. So that's rockets. So it was funded by NASA. And I've always loved aerospace. And I always wanted to work on rockets, and in fact had a job lined up to go and work at Caltech on that, which is like one of the meccas of rocketry, pardon the pun. And I then something happened. And I want to talk about this tomorrow in my presentation, because these days we're so rigid in our thinking of the 5-year plan, right, of what we want to do, and especially the youth, there's a lot of constraints, and I want to tell them about this. So had that job lined up, and then had a 2-minute conversation that changed everything.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was giving a presentation at a conference, and then someone came up to me afterwards, not met him before, and he said, "Really enjoyed your presentation. I have this idea to use rockets to fire vaccines into the skin. Would you like to come and work with me?" And I thought, that really sounds interesting. So I asked 2 questions. So the first was, let me see, it was, where is it? Where would it be? And he said, at Oxford University. And I asked, would I get a chance to row? And he said, if you're good enough. So I said, yes. Well, there's a bit more involved in that, and it's not that easy to get into Oxford. But that changed everything. Right. So I went to Oxford for 8 years. I was a lecturer there, and co-developed this device. So this is like a real-life Star Trek device. It's a gene gun. So instead of using rockets a lot of rockets are killing machines, right? So instead of doing that, it's turning around and using that science for devices to keep people alive.
Yeah.
That was the thinking. And that changed everything for me. It was a wonderful experience. I was not the original inventor of this, but an inventor, and learned how to do that. It was like a great apprenticeship in innovation, how to take ideas forward, work in interdisciplinary teams, and not feel afraid to go and learn another field if you're not satisfied with what's happening.
Yeah.
So that was that experience.
Yeah.
And that led to another step in the journey, which was triggered around 2003. So Bill Gates,
Yeah.
right? So Bill forms his foundation with his wife, Melinda, puts out a call around the world for improved vaccines for the developing world, and the challenge for engineers to help in that space. And I sat down and thought about how to make the gene gun work in that space, but it wouldn't. It's too complicated, too expensive. There's a lot of good reasons why it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
That was actually really depressing. When you're tied up with your tech, it's of course it's an intellectual tie-up, but it's an emotional one too.
Right.
Some say it's a bit like a marriage, actually. So what do? So encouraged by my colleagues there at Oxford, I started learning immunology and designed this new thing, which is called the Nanopatch, needle-free vaccine delivery patch. So mapped the skin's immune system, designed this, and got going. And around that time, moved back to Australia as a professor of biomedical engineering, and then took this forward. And down the track, in fact, Bill Gates did fund this work directly.
Wow.
And it's now going forward. It's in clinical trials and working with the World Health Organization for polio eradication. So that was that step in the journey.
Yeah.
But here we are now. It's personalized medicine and wearable devices. So it's taking it to the next level, doing it far more quickly because this field is the classic pharmaceutical field. It's 15 years from idea to product. And another way of putting it is just taking everything you've learnt and transcribing it into what the current need is. Yeah. And the current need is along the lines of what I've articulated before.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. We spoke with a gentleman yesterday. His name is Chi Ming Ho. He's also an aerospace engineer and graduate. He worked at Hopkins for years, and he's now at UCLA. He's retired, but he's running a center there, taking his sort of know-how in implementing tech to do personalized medicine as well. So there's some theme here that I didn't know existed, but this crossover. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that rocket science and aerospace crosses so well over into thinking about personalized medicine? Like, what is it?
Oh, so I'm not sure if we have enough data points to be a trend,
Right.
but certainly I did see his presentation yesterday and talk with him last night, and he's fantastic. So he's a rock star in his own right. So I really admire his work. So let me think. Aerospace, it's an interesting area. It's really, really challenging, and it's reductionist. So one can spend his or her whole career looking at some interaction and make a good contribution to science. But it's, at the time I made the decision to get into the medical area, it was over 20 years ago. And at that time, it felt like a lot of the fun stuff and rockets had already been done.
Right.
Yeah. Now it's changed a bit with SpaceX and Elon Musk and such like. But at that point, you could be doing some things, but we'd already been to the moon. There wasn't any line of sight of anything new or interesting that was taking place.
Right.
Yet then you look across at the medical world, and it just felt like this completely green pasture where I could sense that there was a role to play for engineers, that we just asked different sorts of questions to add value, a much greater amount of value, a greater contribution than being one of the hordes in the aerospace area. So that was my gut feel, and it's come to pass that way. It's humbling. Engineers, we're so used to seeing things really tightly defined and characterized, and biology is nothing like that. Biology is very descriptive. There's so much that's not known. So you have to grapple with that and kind of be at peace with it, I suppose. And also, the different languages is interesting. So take immunology. So in the vaccine space, I've needed to work with immunologists a lot, and they really do it's stereotypes, right? Yeah. But immunologists do think really differently to a typical engineer.
Right.
So very descriptive. And I'll give you one example. So there's a guy at Oxford who's been a world expert in a certain type of immune cell called a Langerhans cell. And he's been studying them for 30 years. And I meet him and we get talking, we get along well. And so I say, well, how big are they? Oh, I'm not really sure. I said, but you've been looking at them for 30 years. How fast do they move when they move? Oh, I hadn't thought about it. There's just a bunch of different questions. So by no means we have all the answers as engineers, but we can certainly add value.
Yeah, and bring new questions to the table. Does this device here, does it have a name? And what things exactly does it do in the pursuit of helping, for instance, with the eradication of polio?
Sure. So this device is called the Nanopatch. Okay. It's a needle-free vaccine delivery patch, and it's a form of needle-free vaccination. So that's self-evident. So it removes the need of the needle, and that excites a lot of people. But it's not really the primary benefit. It's there and it's useful. The primary benefit is because it places vaccine to the skin's immune cells, it reduces the amount of vaccine that you need. So in the animal model, we've shown that it can be potentially 1/100th of the dose compared to the needle. And because the vaccine's dry, it doesn't need refrigeration. So it's a way of providing a potential step change over how things are currently done, which is the needle and syringe. And
so thought of another way then, potentially up to 100 people could be vaccinated for the same dose that currently is vaccinating one person.
Correct. Once it's proven fully in people, it's been done in the animal model. Or another way of putting it is with vaccines, new generation vaccines, they're very expensive, and it's prohibitively expensive for people to use. This can make it more affordable as well, because a lot of the cost is tied up in the vaccine itself. So that's the Nanopatch, and I helped take that forward. It's now in clinical testing, and the first clinical trials have been positive and have been published, and it's going forward commercially, which is great, in partnership with the WHO.
Wow. That's incredibly exciting. I mean, that's an entire community in many places, as opposed to one person being vaccinated.
That's right. Yeah.
That's tremendously exciting. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's very interesting, and we will certainly tune in for your keynote.
Thank you.